All right, afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone's having a good day. I know it's a little hot outside, but I'm going to go ahead and get started here with kind of chapter 2 notes, which is going to really kind of focus on, how do sociologists do research? What do they look for? Kind of the questions they ask, and really going to spend a lot of time talking about the difference between quantitative data and qualitative data. So hopefully remember that you need to read the chapter. That's going to be the best thing for your reading quiz on Friday. But we're going to try to break down at least the parts that are going to be on the test for sure. Some slides I'm going to spend more time on. Some I'm just going to kind of skim over just because it's either really basic or it's not regarding the test. Okay, so here we go. Just looking at kind of the objectives. I kind of already said it already. We're going to be looking at the basic concepts. For most of you, kind of are familiar with the scientific method of research. Sociologists do the same thing, they just kind of change a few things within that. You'll kind of see the questions that they ask as we go on and kind of look at the history from it. And then there's still some, questions that sociologists always look at that are unanswered, and we'll kind of talk about how there's a variety of answers within those situations. So the first part here, just going to talk about the most basic thing of research. There's two different types: quantitative and qualitative research, right? When you look at those are the only two methods that are going to be used in sociology research. And they have a rich and important tradition of using both these methods, as they're really equally important. There's not one that's better than the other. What does quantitative do? Well, it allows sociologists to incorporate increasing amounts of data in their research. So when you think of quantitative, I want you to think of tables, graphs, statistics. It's numbers based. It's things that have happened based on surveys. It's everything that data shows. Okay? Qualitative method is more of using empathy and sociological thinking to reach a deeper understanding of the subject matter, right? That's when they're kind of making personal observations or their experiments or things that you can actually see. So whether it's sitting in a classroom, watching people in a classroom, or watching people at the mall, or you are physically doing something, or someone's physically did something where they were there, they saw it, and they recorded the results. You can see a lot of it could be interviews, experiments, etc. Within the research process, here's kind of the four basic things that they do right away. Okay, number one is you need to research a problem. Okay, this is the stage that the sociologist determines where the gaps exist in an understanding about a topic. So the same thing when you do your term papers, you're going to be trying to find a problem or ask some sort of question. All right. You're kind of looking at what questions haven't been answered, what puzzles still haven't been solved, and you've got to make sure that you're kind of narrowing down your topic choice. Okay? At this stage, then the sociologists raise questions that often start out with what, where, how, when, or why. Your basic kind of concepts to really understand what the research problem is. That brings us to the second step of research process, and that's when the sociologist spends a lot of time reviewing the research that has been conducted about it. This is called your literature review. You're looking at all the peer review sources. What have people done with this problem? What have they found out? And again, this could include both quantitative and qualitative data, but you are basically reviewing what other people wrote about it. And the same questions are kind of being revisited. What have already been raised and solved? What issues have been solved? Are there still questions unanswered? If there's still some things that are based on that aren't unanswered, then you're kind of finding out what the problem is or what your question will be. All right? When you're reviewing that evidence, it clarifies the topic and it gives the sociologists better ideas about how to carry out their research. Right? And then after that, after they review the evidence, now you're ready to make a problem or create a problem that's precise and something that you can solve. This is where you form a hypothesis. So this is where you're kind of having an idea, and for ones that don't know about a hypothesis, you are raising a question. You are creating something that you're trying to figure out. All right? Their refinement of the research problem, it's posed in the first step, so you're kind of reevaluating what you did within step number one. And you're trying to formulate something where you're able to evaluate evidence and try to find an answer. It might not be one answer, but it might be multiple answers. Okay? You'll have facts or data that will either support or disprove the hypothesis. right? And when you get to the fourth step now is you're going to figure out a research design. Are you going to do a survey? Are you going to do interviews? Are you going to be a participant observation? Are you going to experiment? Whatever it is, you have to figure out how am I going to solve that problem? What methods am I going to use? Okay. And then carrying out kind of the final parts here of this kind of research process, you have to carry out the research. So this is where you're taking data that are systematically gathered according to the research design, and basically you are kind of doing the experiments, doing the interviews. You are taking the time to get multiple sources that are going to help you answer your question. Realize that sometimes plans are going to fall through or not work out. People aren't going to cooperate. Data is not available. So sometimes this is where you're finding out, okay, I have a design method, I'm trying to get my questions answered, but it doesn't always work out that way. All right? So the more that the sociologist kind of completes the work of the previous steps, the better the situation's going to be. All right? Realize that once data has already been gathered, analyzed, and then the interpretation can be, and that's where we're with step number 6. Okay, computers sometimes often help the sociologists sort through a bit different things. So you'll notice that that'll kind of change how sociologists will kind of organize data. Right? When interpreting the results, the sociologist tries to answer his or her initial questions, and then they determine if the data supports the research, the hypothesis. So now you're going to try to say, all right, here's my question. What are the results? What can I say? Is my hypothesis correct? Is it not correct? And why? Even with careful work at previous stations, we often end up with partial answers. So it's never kind of a full answer or yes or no. It's kind of sometimes or, in this situation it was, my hypothesis was correct. In other situations it wasn't. And then finally, you're going to report the results, all right? You might do a research report. You might create a published journal, presentation, but basically you are putting it all together, all right? Within that, where's kind of this whole process start? Well, realize that this whole research process started in the University of Chicago. Sociology was kind of shaping as a discipline there. And that's where you got these two guys. The one on the left is Robert Park, and the other one's William Ogborn. They were very important figures. Both of them kind of came up with the sociological research method that put these practices in use today. Park, what did he focus on? He focused on interview and firsthand observations, so more of the qualitative data, where more Ogborn's the science and more of the quantitative data. All right, so since we spent time talking about the process, let's go ahead and go through some research methods. Okay, there are many different forms of research methods that exist in sociology. The most common are fieldwork, what's known as participation observation, and also survey methods, right? Often it's useful that they're going to kind of combine a lot of these methods. You're not just going to pick one where, I'm just going to do interviews or I'm going to do observation. Most of the time you're going to combine two different types of methods within that. This table in your graph 2.1 does a really good job of looking at different research methods. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but realize they give the strengths and weaknesses for each of them. Okay. We'll go ahead and talk about a few of those and just kind of what's the basics of each one. Ethnography, to be honest, this is a new term for me. I usually just kind of talk about it as participation observation, but I think this is something new within this textbook, right? It's also what's called basically field work, right? It results in a rich and deep data that reveal a lot about complicated social processes. However, because researchers have to spend a lot of time in this field making observations, usually you only can study one group, one community at a time, which means, it takes a lot more time and you are pretty minimal within the data that you're using. If you're only going to study Slayton, for example, for one of your questions, well, that's not going to be really helpful compared to people that live in big cities. When sociologists employ ethnography, they study people firsthand, which often means conducting participation, observation, and interviews. In participation observation, what you do is the researcher takes part of the activities or the community, and they become familiar with kind of the topic, and not simply making observations. So, for example, if I wanted to study what it's like to be in a sociology class as a high school student, if I'm doing participation observation, maybe I'm going to be that high school student for the day. I'm going to sit in the class, I'm going to do the homework, I'm being part of the course in the class. And that's kind of the idea, is where you are actually involved and you're not just looking at it as an outsider. Excuse me. The next research method is surveys. Within surveys, it's a major research method, right? These can include questionnaires. They could be face-to-face, they could be by telephone, they could be through text, they could be through mail, they could be through internet, targeted at some sort of group of people. Okay, when surveys are used as questionnaires, they usually can be administered to the population being studied. So if I'm going to be like, okay, I want to kind of put surveys for seniors only, I'll just send a survey through the email database to seniors only. All right, it can generate a lot of data. It's a lot faster than participating observation. I can get results really quickly. All right, you can use statistics to analyze different things. You can compare. Oh, what did juniors, seniors, sophomores what was the differences between that? Okay, surveys can include random sampling, right? Where basically you aren't just picking the people to answer the survey. It could be you could go from letters A to Z and it's randomly handed out to a bunch of different people. It's not just a specific grade level. All right. The population is usually the people who are the focus of the research. And there's usually two different types of questionnaires that are used in surveys. One is standard or fixed choice, where basically it's like your multiple choice, where it's yes or no, there's no expanding. And the other one's open-ended, where it's like you're explaining why, or every answer could be a little bit different. A trial run is a survey in which only a few people participate, so you're just trying to see, kind of get a grasp on the topic of what people are thinking about it. It's often used in work out in any difficult situations that it may occur before it's administered to wider populations. So basically they want to test it out before they're going to give it to a bunch of people. All right? Another name for that kind of trial run is what's known as a pilot study. Okay? Just some key terms here within surveys when we look at it. Remember, it can focus on a small proportion of an overall group, and that's what some of these terms are about. Sampling is a very complex process. Basically, statisticians have developed complex rules for developing accurate samples. To achieve accuracy, a sample must be representative. It must be representative of the whole population as a whole. All right. Within that, you'll have what's called random sampling, which is an important procedure that helps ensure that the sample is being representative. So usually what happens is the research will give the survey to a random sample of a larger population. All right. And then they would kind of analyze that data from there. So your textbook uses kind of an example that I want to give you. It says, an example of research conducted by college students. Many students who conduct a survey research on the college campus are interested in asking fellow students to participate. But they usually don't have the resources to ask all the students to participate. So they may ask the school officials to randomly select a smaller group of students that they can ask to participate in their research. What happens then is this random selection ensures that each student in the population has an equal chance of being chosen for the sample. Excuse me. Random sampling usually improves the ability for students to generalize for the entire college. Surveys are a great way to ask a lot of different questions. Basically what we're saying is surveys are very efficient for a research method. Next part here, experiments. This will be pretty brief here, but it's another really key research method in sociology. Basically, within an experiment, an advantage is that you give the researcher control over their independent variables, so they can kind of determine a cause and effect. So this is where you want cause and effects when you're doing an experiment. When I do this, this is going to happen. Okay. Many experiments are really easy replicated, so it can be in a controlled environment, so you can do it many different times. But one of the problems is the way people act in highly controlled settings is not how they would behave in natural environments, right? So the example that kind of your book talks about is like when a teacher is getting kind of evaluated. What happens? The principal comes in, sits in the back of the room. What does the teacher do? Probably a little bit more serious, making sure everyone's on task. Maybe, they're not really, they know that they're being watched, so they change their behavior based on that. Because sociologists are more interested in studying people in natural settings, they usually do not perform a lot of experimental research because of that. They want to see it from the natural standpoint, not from a controlled area. It's easier to do cause and effect, but because it's so difficult to replicate in a natural environment, usually sociologists kind of stay away from that. Okay? One that we'll talk about here is what's known as the famous Stanford prison experiment. And that's a really interesting experiment to try to replicate social life. And we're going to spend some time here, probably next week, examining that. All right. These statistical terms now, it's basically basic math terms. I'm not going to read every definition down, but I would make sure that you understand kind of the differences between it, okay? This is how sociologists kind of look at statistical terms, and then they kind of break down this data based on these terms. So again, you're going to notice that the first two, measures of central tendency, correlation coefficients, I wouldn't spend a lot of time doing that, but you should know what the mean is. You should know what the mode is. You should know what the median is, standard deviation, etc. Take the time, make sure you're reading your book, get those terms down, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time kind of going over those differences there. All right, so getting into kind of comparative historical research. Basically what this does is it compares behaviors, attitudes, other aspects of social life that came across a specific time, place, or group. When we look at this, it allows sociologists to determine if social behavior or attitudes vary across a time, place, or group. So we're basically taking time in history and evaluating how it changes over a specific amount of time. Someone that's performing comparative research will utilize any research methods that already have been mentioned in gathering their information used. So they're basically using all the data that's already been done and kind of comparing it as time changes. So an example that your textbook uses is someone may analyze survey results from 2 or more different countries and conduct field work and interviews in multiple communities. And they might look at census data or from 5 different decades to analyze kind of that change over time. So now we're going to get into the unanswered portion of this kind of textbook. And this is probably the time I would make sure that you spend time reading this part of chapter because it's very kind of complex and understanding the comprehension piece. All right. In chapter 1, the text discussed about the discipline of sociology, what it is. And the second question that's going into this chapter is, how is social order possible? Sociologists don't take the order for granted. They ask why people behave, because we're not taking common sense. It's why do people behave in the pattern ways that they are? It's because a lot of times social life is pattern. Sociologists are trying to understand if events relate to each other. So within those tools that they have is specifically analysts. They want to study and allow how are two things correlated with each other. Are they? Can we use cause and effect, or are we just using correlation? All right. So the big thing that you need to understand here is correlation is not the same as causation, all right? Just because two things correlate doesn't mean it's because they cause and effect type things. So let's take an example from your book, all right? There's a strong correlation between two variables, deaths by drowning and ice cream sales, all right? So your text kind of talks about that. When ice cream sales are high, deaths by drowning are also high. But no one would say that ice cream sales cause drowning deaths to occur, all right? So realize that those two things don't kind of cause an effect, but they are a correlation between it, all right? So you can kind of make a correlation between those two things. There's a third factor, the season, all right? You need to understand that. It explains why ice cream sales are maybe down or maybe up, and drowning deaths are also associated with each other. So realize that, the season of summer probably makes the chances of those numbers going up. It is when the summer the ice cream sales are high, and it's also when the summer is when deaths are drowning. So thus those variables may be related to each other, but they're not responsible. I can't stress this enough that you have to make sure that correlation and cause and effect doesn't necessarily go together, all right? They can be different. Unanswered question number 2. Can we really study human social life in a scientific way? When we look at this, the questions a researcher asks are different depending on the approaches taken. Specifically, are we looking at from the functionalist perspective, conflict, symbolic interaction, etc. Right? A rational choice set of theorists asks different questions, and then they develop different explanations for why the social life happens. But when we have something that's common in research that is grounded by facts and data, then all three of those perspectives can kind of cooperate together. In other words, sociological research is scientific research. They are kind of the same thing, but just done in a different way. It's all based on what's called empirical investigation, which means factual inquiries carried out in a sociological study. Facts and data are gathered according to a set of procedures, and then they're looked at systematically. So then sociologists are able to look through theory and employ the logic that they're trying to find. All right, that is all I have for you today. Hopefully you're not sleeping or sweating in a hot room. Maybe the sub decided to bring you to the auditorium or Mr. Carlson's room. But if you have any questions, give me an email. Otherwise, we'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow. Have a good day.